There's an accusation that we simply copied everything. Most of those who want to criticize Islam feel compelled to attack Bukhari or Shafi because they are considered the founders of the foundational principles of Islam. Where did this accusation come from? We're confused about these two scholars in particular. What new contributions did Muslim scholars make to the field of history? Europe learned about Greek heritage through Arabic translations. My friend, when we study history, we feel that the books are incredibly large and overwhelming. Yet, when you pick up a book by any Orientalist, you find it easy and clear, and you can read it without any problem. Some Orientalists found it difficult to attribute these enormous contributions to the humanities to Muslims. We've also become afflicted with a psychological condition, but there's something that's troubling me and causing me distress. I'm trying to ascertain whether this issue is a matter of doubt or not. The doubt has turned it into something reprehensible. How can I distinguish between falling into doubt and simply asking a normal, ordinary question? Is it possible to differentiate between falling into doubt and intellectual deviation from a single question? Music. This is it. In the third episode of the 100 Questions in History series with our regular guest, Professor Mohammed Al-Harmi, we've reached question 7. Professor Mohammed, this series, Young People, is where we answer pressing questions about history. Question 7. Some people say when we study history, we feel that these books, Islamic history books, for example, are full of chains of transmission, full of narratives, and so complex. They feel very bulky, making it difficult for us to study history. But then you go and get a book by any Orientalist, and you find it easy and clear, and you can continue reading it without any problem. Yes, so how can we explain this or answer this question? In the name of God, the most gracious, the most merciful, and peace and blessings be upon the messenger of God, his family, his companions, and those who follow him. This is a very good question, and the answer begins with understanding why our scholars chose to write history in this way. Why, for example, are most Islamic history books written in annals? They might say, in the year 37, it happened so, and after he finishes the events, he brings up the year 38, saying, such and such happened. Why does he interrupt the events? Why doesn't he narrate them all at once? Or as the questioner mentioned when he spoke about the issue of the book being full of chains of transmission. So every report is so-and-so told us, so-and-so told us, so-and-so told us. Look, sir, firstly, our scholars, by their very nature, were not incapable of writing this story. I mean, this story is something people have known since the dawn of history. So, scholars were not incapable of writing a story. But this brings us back to what we talked about in previous episodes, that the scholars' purpose in writing Islamic history was not to tell a story. I mean, it wasn't to say 1, 2, 3 happened. You're not presenting a story. Rather, their purpose was to record, document, and preserve. So history is what it is. Do you remember when we said that Khalifa Ibn Qaryat said, and through history people knew the times of their prayers, their fasting, their pilgrimage, the number of their wives, and the location of their deaths. And when Al-Qarwi said, and through history the births and deaths of the imams and the narrators are known, and so on. The purpose is historical. When Muslims wrote it, the purpose was recording, documenting, and preserving, not presenting entertaining or useful stories to people. That wasn't their real aim. There's something I want to point out here that also represents a key to understanding Islamic history and contemporary histories. Let me give a simple example. Now, you're watching a satellite channel, Al Jazeera, or Al Arabiya, or any satellite channel. This channel has a correspondent, let's say a correspondent in Washington, and an analyst in the studio. A correspondent's job is to report the news. The correspondent reports the news. An analyst's job in the studio is to analyze the news, connect it to other news. So, receiving the news is the correspondent's job of discovering the news, recording the news, presenting the news. But analyzing the news, interpreting the news, explaining the news, understanding the news. That's the studio. Of course, there might be a talented correspondent who can both gather and analyze at the same time. Islamic history, Sheikh Murad, has a separation between the task of gathering information and the task of explaining, analyzing, and interpreting history as he understood it. For Muslims, in the past, the process of recording and documenting was merely a matter of recording. It wasn't the historian's role in Islamic culture to explain, analyze, and interpret. Their role was simply to record, document, and write down. This approach was contradicted by the Western school of history. The Western school combined these two roles, the role of searching for information and the role of analyzing and interpreting that information. That's why Western history books, especially those written after the 18th century, the discipline of history in the West is considered to have been established in the mid-18th century, require the historian to gather information, organize it, explain, analyze, and interpret it, ultimately producing a summary. A contemporary history book is a product of the Western historical school, a school where you pick up a book and read the story from beginning to end. The historian then gathers information from history books, political newspapers, statements, archives, and artifacts. Their task is to collect, analyze, explain, and interpret it. Muslims, however, had a separation between the role of the recorder and the role of the historian. The role of the one who records and analyzes is crucial. That's why early Islamic history books, in particular, focused solely on recording, documenting, and verifying. To present the best method of recording, documenting, and verifying, I must adhere to the chronological order. In such and such year, such and such happened. In such and such year, such and such happened. And in such and such year, it's unacceptable to blur the lines by saying things like so-and-so died, or the imam, narrator, or figure died in such and such year. Similarly, when presenting news, I must attribute it to its source. I should say, so-and-so told me, or so-and-so told me, or so-and-so told me. If we have another account, I should obtain it from a different source. I can't simply say so-and-so told me, or so-and-so told me, and then present the entire story as I've compiled it. That would be a breach of accuracy. The precise approach is to say, for example, I heard the news on Al Jazeera in this way, or I heard it on Al Arabiya in this way, or I heard it on an Egyptian satellite channel in this way. This approach offers the greatest degree of accuracy and precision when presenting it to someone. I remain precise, but suppose I said, no, the matter happened in such and such a way, and then I combined 3 different accounts. I would have violated the condition of accuracy. This is the fundamental condition that the Muslim historian wrote for to fulfill. That's why our Islamic history books didn't turn out to be pleasant, entertaining stories. They turned out to be books full of chains of transmission, isn't it? These chains of transmission break down a single event, and they're also full of chronicles, annals. These chronicles also break down an event that spans 2 years or more. So we can't understand the work of the Muslim historian unless we understand his purpose. What did he have to do? Let me give you an example. Let me tell you a story, just to lighten the academic tone I'm using. During the Abbasid era, there was a minister named Abu al-Qasim ibn Maslamir, a famous minister in the Abbasid state. A poem was written about him, one of the most beautiful poems of praise. The poet said, if Abu al-Qasim's hands were generous to us, none but the sea and the rain could praise him, and if the light of his forehead shone upon us, the fires of the sun and the moon would pale. He who does not take heed of the terror of his power does not know what is disturbing. Death and fate are important. I mean, a nice poem, a little something to grab your attention, without me saying it all now. The point is that this man was approached one day by a group of Jews from Khaybar who said to him, you keep taking the jizya tribute, and we already have a document from the messenger of God, peace and blessings be upon him, stating that he exempts us from the jizya. Here is the document, preserved in our archives. Meaning, the Jew. Of course, now the minister found himself in front of her document bearing the signature of the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him. So what did he do? He brought the famous Imam al-Khatib al-Baghdadi, the author of Tariq Baghdad, History of Baghdad, the author of Iqtidar wal Ilm al-Amal, the requirement of knowledge and action. This well-known man, al-Khatib al-Baghdadi, as soon as he looked at it, said, "This is a lie." He was asked, "And what is your proof that it is a lie?" He said, "Because it contains the testimony of Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan, one of the witnesses to this document. One of the witnesses is Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan, who did not convert to Islam until the year of the conquest after Khaybar, and it contains the testimony of Sa'd ibn Mu'adh, who had he died during the days of Khaybar, that Sayyid Mu'adh died in the Battle of the Trench." It became clear over the years, it became clear through history, the corruption of this documented verse. Why do we say this? We say that the Muslims, in their work on history, focused on accuracy, recording the event in its time and in its details. Where do these details come from? What is their source? That's why Sufyan al-Thawri used to say, "There is no better way to expose liars than through history. History is the best way to expose liars, because they lie and fabricate." Hamad ibn Zayd also said something similar. If narrators use lies, we will use history against them. What does this resemble? Let me tell you a nice story from our reality. In Egypt, we had someone named Nasser Hamid Abu Zaid. Nasser Hamid Abu Zaid had a problem with the principles of jurisprudence. You know, the principles of jurisprudence are a solid science. Look at the Sharia. You could say there are two sciences that guard it: the science of hadith and the science of the principles of jurisprudence. The science of hadith prevented weak things from infiltrating the Sharia. The science of the principles of jurisprudence prevented them from infiltrating the Sharia. The misunderstandings of Sharia are important. Yes, these two are the ones standing guard over Sharia, and that's why you'll find that most of those who want to attack Islam are confused about these two scholars. Specifically, they must attack Bukhari because he is the master of hadith, or Shafi'i because he is the master of usul al-fiqh, principles of jurisprudence. Nasser Hamid Abu Zaid, in order to attack Shafi'i, said that Shafi'i was an Arab nationalist, fanatical towards Arabs, and a bigot who cursed Arab nationalism, and that's why he was at odds with the Umayyads. He has a famous book called Imam Shafi'i and the Establishment of the Moderate Ideology. Of course, when this book was first published, it was a scandal for him, as he says that Imam Shafi'i was part of the Umayyad state's attempt to control the intellectual sphere, and because Shafi'i was born 18 years after the end of the Umayyad state, it was scandal to say that so-and-so was cooperating with the Umayyad state, and then it turns out that so-and-so was born after the state's demise, the Umayyads. This means what it means to not rely on history to refute liars. For example, there are clear examples like what I'm telling you. You know, for instance, Abu Naim, one of the famous imams, was sitting in a gathering when someone fabricated a hadith about the Battle of Siffin. He said, "While we were at Siffin, Abdullah ibn Mas'ud came out to us." Abu Naim said to him, "Do you think he was resurrected after death, since Ibn Mas'ud died before Siffin?" The liar was stunned. For example, there's a hadith like that of Dr. Ibrahim Wad, a professor of literature, when he wanted to prove that Tahir Hussein stole the idea of pre-Islamic poetry from the Orientalist Marduliath. How did he prove it? He traced Tahir Hussein's writings before Marduliath's book on pre-Islamic poetry was published. What was his opinion on pre-Islamic poetry in his earlier works? He found that Tahir Hussein didn't question pre-Islamic poetry. As soon as Marduliath's book was published, Tahir Hussein began writing his own book on pre-Islamic poetry. So, tracing history reveals a lot of lies, so Muslims developed the science of history to serve their religion, to distinguish between abrogating and abrogated verses, to understand the sunnah of the Prophet peace and blessings be upon him, and to learn about the actions of the rightly guided caliphs. Therefore, their primary aim was accurate model of months and years and the model of chains of transmission isnad. Someone might say, but doesn't this make history books difficult, limit their usefulness, and hinder our understanding of the sunnah? I would reply that's true because discovering the laws of history was and solely the task of the historian in the Islamic world. That's the historian's task in the Western context today. The historian in the Islamic world didn't see it as his sole responsibility to extract lessons. That task was the responsibility of all Muslims, including the exegete, the jurist, the preacher, the Sufi, and even the poet, who also contributes to understanding the lessons of history. Discovering the laws of history wasn't the sole responsibility of the historian, it was the responsibility of everyone. Those who speak on Islamic sciences, well, why did the West take this approach? Someone might ask, why is it that Westerners produced their history books in this beautiful format, where the entire story is centered around the historian, who, after gathering information, analyzes and interprets it? It's a good question, and the answer is similar. The Muslim historian, when writing history, wasn't writing history with the laws of history unknown to him. These laws are found in the Quran, in the Sunnah prophetic traditions, in the sayings of the companions and their successors, and in the sayings of scholars. For example, when Ibn Khaldun wrote that injustice is a harbinger of the destruction of civilization, where did he get that from? Or when he said that the wealthy are enemies of the prophets, where did he get that from? From the verse, we did not send any messenger before you to a city except that its wealthy said, indeed, we found our fathers following the ways of the way of Allah, and we are following in their footsteps. So, the Muslim historian wasn't reading history to discover these laws. No, these traditions are not something he absorbed, but rather, when the Western historian turned away from Christianity and was left without religion and without an ideological horizon, he began to search history with the aim of discovering historical traditions and rules. He needed, along with the news and the event, to explain, interpret, and analyze it. For example, the first person to whom this step is attributed is Voltaire. Voltaire was sitting in a gathering when a woman, I forget her name, I don't remember if it was Chatelet or something, came to him and said, so, as a French woman, when I pick up a history book, what benefit do I get from it? That Ertugrul was a father of Osman, that such and such war took place in such and such a place, and so on. These are incomprehensible details to her, meaningless. From that moment, the movement of Western history began to write history in a philosophical way, combining the collection of news with attempts to interpret and explain it. They combined the role of the reporter with that of the analyst on the channel. So, Christianity turned to discovering historical traditions because the Westerners, they turned to the discovery of the Sunnah prophetic traditions occurred because they abandoned Christianity and no longer had constants or a system of thought. Therefore, the schools of thought that interpret history multiplied. Some interpreted history through a specific lens, others through ethnicity, materialism, or geography. Many schools emerged. What do you have? History is a vast collection of events, and depending on the intellectual framework, you can piece them together into a coherent understanding. They became lost and wandered in the valleys of interpretation. This kind of interpretation was not present among Muslim historians. This means that our scholars were not incapable of understanding the narrative. Our scholars had a purpose in history to record and document. That's why their books came in this form, to Reassure the person asking this question. There are abridged versions of the large, voluminous books filled with footnotes and chains of transmission. There are abridged versions available. Even contemporary Muslim historians, I mean. If someone were to ask me what to read about the history of the Umayyad state, because I understand their preferences and nature, it won't work for him to be told to go and look at al-Tabari's history, for example, or Ibn Sard's Tabakat, or read Ibn Asakir's History of Damascus, or al-Khatib al-Baghdadi's History of Baghdad. These are overwhelming things, and their system is different for someone who wants to learn about the Umayyad state. No, I tell him, for example, to read the book The Umayyad State, the Misrepresented State by Dr. Hadi Shayan, for example, or the book The Umayyad State by Sheikh Ali al-Salarbi, for example. These are books written with a style that suits the modern reader. But now, the answer I'm giving is, why didn't the old books of Islamic history suit our modern tastes? Is this a problem with them or with us? Is it their methodology or ours? So I'm telling you the big story. A big story is that this man didn't intend to tell a story. So when did we start telling a story? We're influenced by the Western approach. So why did they want to create a story? Because when they abandoned Christianity, a new opportunity opened up for them. The way to interpret it is that they wanted a fully explained and reasoned story, all in one book. If the person who asked this question, describing this vast history and heritage as difficult and complex, then from what you answered, we understand that it is a great blessing, its advantages countless. Of course, but let me add something. You've just opened up an important question for me. If someone were to ask me which is better, the method of the early Muslims or the method of the moderns, I would completely favor the method of the early Muslims. Why? Because we have often found this in practice. Many people were gifted with the talent for gathering and investigating, but lacked the talent for analysis. You know, like a skilled journalist who lacks the ability to analyze. The channel tasked him with gathering and analyzing the news, so he excels at gathering, but not at analysis. The final result is negative, not positive, because he did indeed bring me the news with journalistic efficiency, but when he came to interpret it, he came up with an incorrect interpretation. So, civilizations, when they came up with this, did not burden the historian with more than he could bear in terms of gathering and comprehension. This is something the Western school of thought has burdened its founder with. Many of the history books we've seen have historians who gather information from archives, went back and forth, researched, and then, when they arrive at an interpretation, it's weak, incorrect. They try to derive a theory, but it's a flimsy one. I want to tell you that I lean towards the Muslim school because it didn't burden the historian with more than just the talent for gathering information. It also demanded the talent for reasoning, analysis, and interpretation. That's why you find books in our Islamic civilization called History of such and such, like the Great History of al-Bukhari, for example, or the History of Nishapur, or the History of Bayhaq. When you open the book, you don't find history, you find men. A Great History of al-Bukhari, for instance, only lists people. It tells you, so-and-so narrated, so-and-so narrated, so-and-so narrated from him, and he died in such and such year. Is this what you call history? Yes, it's history for Muslims. Those who record, verify, and document. Those who want to know the imams, the narrators, and the dates of death would compile a history book called that. The one who writes the history of Nishapur writes about the scholars, the people of Nishapur, each one of them. What is his name? What is its translation? What year did he die? Who heard from him? Who heard from whom? This fulfills the purpose of the historian who wrote this book and aims to portray the state of Islamic civilization, but it does not conform to the Western historical school that has become prevalent in our time. Therefore, you should expect that you will read the history of Nishapur. I mean, if the phrase history of Nishapur was written by an ancient person and written by a contemporary one, the material inside will be completely different. Of course, one person is writing the history of the figures, and the other is writing the history of the city and what happened to it. I mean, you have the history of Baghdad or the history of Damascus by Ibn Asakir. Look at the history of Damascus by Ibn Asakir. It is 80 volumes, something huge. What is the history of Damascus? It is a collection of biographies of the Muslim figures who lived in Damascus or passed through it. My God. So you enter and you find that it is working alphabetically, letter Aleph, letter Bar, letter Tar, Damascus, and then this it unfolds gradually and sequentially, so we must understand the purposes or goals. The author intended the shape of his civilization, the Islamic civilization from which he originated, or the Western civilization from which he drew, because this influences our understanding of the material he produced. However, there will be a significant and substantial difference between someone reading those books, for example, on the history of the Umayyad state or the biography of the Prophet, peace be upon him, and someone reading new works by contemporary authors who summarized and compiled what they considered useful or essential. This is what leads, I believe, to a difference, or sometimes even to the rejection of some narratives. We begin to question whether this event actually happened, because the contemporary author will not only shorten the chains of transmission but may also omit parts of their story. As we know in history, every line you cross out or shorten is removed. You removed information, right? You didn't remove anything from the footnotes. I agree with you that this is certainly one of the problems. Someone raised on contemporary books is like someone whose meals are takeout, meaning someone who lives on burgers or pizza. Of course, this is different from someone who eats healthy food. Yes, there are healthy options, but there are only two. Either you become cultured and seek knowledge, or you intend to specialize and study, but you want to be a specialist without studying. You want to be healthy while eating nothing but takeout. It's not right. If you want to be a doctor, you have to study medicine, but you can't study medicine from sitting on Facebook medical pages. That's it. That's all. So, to the brother who says that history books are full of chains of transmission isnad, he's someone who wants to read history in a contemporary style. As soon as he opened a history book, he found the old history books confusing and perplexing, with fragmented accounts and chains of transmission that were confusing. Naturally, he was confused. So, from this question, we move to the eighth question. In this series, the eighth question relates to the idea of what new contributions Muslim scholars made to the field of history. This question, in essence, is where did the idea that Muslim scholars, there's an accusation, a direct one, that we copied everything and didn't write anything ourselves. This might even lead us to the second axis of the story of civilization. Yes, indeed. Did we copy from others? Did others copy from us? But in the field of history, where did this accusation come from? It's true, as I mentioned, the question is whether Muslims added anything to the sciences or were merely transmitters. This will become more apparent when we talk about civilization, because it's a well-known accusation, one made by some Orientalists we discussed in that previous episode. Some Orientalists found it difficult to attribute these enormous contributions to the humanities to Muslims, so they said their role in history was to preserve the ancient heritage, the Greek heritage, because Europe came to know the Greek heritage through Arabic translations. They lived in what's called the Dark Ages. In history, the matter is different. Why is it different? Because the emergence of Islamic history was not based on any previous model. No one can say that Muslims, in their historical writing, they were influenced by a previous civilization. For example, we can say that Muslims were influenced in medicine, philosophy, and engineering by the sciences of the ancients. After a while, they absorbed, assimilated, translated, and added to them, resulting in the pure Islamic sciences. This is the essence of this civilization, which Europe later adopted from us. However, the origin of History itself was unique and unprecedented. Muslims didn't simply see history books from other cultures and then try to imitate them by writing their own history. No, the origin of history, as I mentioned and reiterated several times, stemmed primarily from the desire to preserve and understand the religion. As Ismail ibn teach our children the battles of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, just as we taught them chapters of the Quran. Zayn al-Abidin Ali ibn al-Husayn said, memorize these battles, for in them lies your glory and pride. Teaching the biography of the Prophet, the companions, the rightly guided caliphs, and their actions was a religious imperative. That's why Muslims dedicated themselves to preserving, learning, and transmitting it with the utmost accuracy. It's a history unparalleled, but was this historical aspect, for example, the only addition? I mean, if you were to say that Muslims added to history the process of compilation and the process of criticism and authentication, the issue of biographical classes is because there were no people with the science of hadith criticism, jar war tadil, no people with chains of transmission isnad, and indeed, no people with biographical classes. No one had written about biographical classes before, only Muslims did. So why did they write about biographical classes? They were also trying to organize the religion. They wanted to know which scholars were in a particular class, and which class was below it, and which class was below it, and which class was below it, and which class was below it. So, the division of men and prominent figures into classes is a purely Islamic innovation. These things, chains of transmission, hadith criticism, biographical classes, and biographies, all of these are exclusively Muslim. But even among the additions of Muslims, for example, something like Ibn Khaldun and what he added, about which people disagree, was Ibn Khaldun's work an attempt to discover the rules of society? Is it history, or sociology, or the science of human civilization, as Ibn Khaldun called it? They disagreed, but the important thing is that this is an addition that only came from Muslims. Therefore, Ibn Khaldun himself considered what he added to be a science outside of history. Ibn Khaldun saw it as his work in the introduction is a science outside the realm of history. Contemporary and Western historians see it as being at the heart of history. That's why, for example, someone like Dr. Hussein Mounis says that Ibn Khaldun is simply a historian, because what he does is at the heart of history, explaining and interpreting history. So, you read Ibn Khaldun's introduction, for example, and Westerners are impressed by it. Someone like Arnold Toynbee said about Ibn Khaldun's introduction, of course, Arnold Toynbee is one of the most famous historians of the 20th century. Born 1889 and died 1973, the famous English historian, author of the famous book A Study of History in 10 volumes, and the author of the challenge and response theory that Ibn Khaldun's book was the best book of its kind in any time and place. The praise Ibn Khaldun received from Westerners is much higher than what he received from Muslims, by the way, from his students. This is because Ibn Khaldun's work is considered a tremendous addition, meaning that someone like Marduliouth said that Ibn Khaldun's work was the best book before the invention of printing. I mean, what I want to tell you is, yes, there's something about it that's considered the best book ever written by humans, and we're preoccupied with whether Ibn Khaldun was Egyptian, Tunisian, Moroccan, or Algerian. These are the concerns of weary people, the narrow-minded people who have been crushed by nationalism when we were talking about it. For example, Ibn Khaldun's contribution to the science of history, if we consider it within the realm of history, is a significant, important, and very distinctive one. Likewise, what Muslims added to history was their accounts of the lands and their histories, whether on the level of the meteor they passed through and inhabited. This was started by the modern scholars, or on the level of descriptive plans, like al-Makrizi's plans, for example, who describes Cairo and its surroundings, or Ibn Shaber's history of Medina, or al-Samhudi's Wafir al-Wafir, which also deals with our history of the land. The point is that the contributions of Muslims to the science of history are significant and well known. But the most important contribution, in my opinion, is that the emergence of Islamic history was an authentic one, without any prior example. After that, they began this, means they work within the context of Muslims, such as the issue of biographies and biographical dictionaries, and what Ibn Khaldun and others have written, and they build upon it. This is the 8th question. Now we move on to the 9th question. Yes, and this 9th question is strange and unusual because it relates to a story. How can I differentiate between someone who has fallen into informational or historical doubt and someone who asks a question to educate themselves, or because we have also become afflicted with a psychological condition where the first thing someone asks is, "You are doubtful, you are all doubtful." So, how do we differentiate between them? I mean, how do I distinguish between someone who has fallen into historical doubt and someone who is simply asking a normal, ordinary question? This is also an important question, but I will say again that it is not known, or it is not possible, to differentiate between falling into doubt and intellectual deviation from a single question. Okay, I mean, a single question is something that doesn't reveal whether I have fallen into doubt, or whether the person in front of me is asking it because they are mistaken. It is not enough. Discovery alone isn't enough, because when it appears in abundance. Look, let me tell you something. Let me give you an example. We're essentially asking ourselves, when do I feel that something is ambiguous? When do I feel that the situation has become difficult for me? Or when do I feel that the other party is genuinely asking for knowledge, or is asking to embarrass and attack me if I have pride in Islamic history, a sense of belonging and connection to it? But there's something confusing and troubling me. This is an ambiguity I should ask specialists about to understand. But if I have a lack of confidence in Islamic history, and I am talking about Islamic history now, but this applies to other branches of Islamic law, if I have a lack of confidence in these people, these books, and this whole subject, then the issue is no longer just a single ambiguity. Here, the issue has become a deviation, an intellectual deviation. Many who started with ambiguities because they didn't try to address them correctly by asking someone knowledgeable ended up deviating. So, I mean, I recently saw a video by someone titled "The Role of Hadith Scholars in Spreading Shiism." When I opened the video, he said that scholars of the Prophet's hadiths are one of the most important reasons for the spread of Shiism in the Islamic world. This isn't a doubt anymore. A doubt is when I ask, for example, how al-Bukhari narrated a hadith, or how a hadith was transmitted by hadith scholars. That's a partial doubt. But when someone believes that hadith scholars spread Shiism, what does that mean? Someone who believes that the nation has gone astray, that's heresy, outside the mainstream. This is deviation. This is deviation. So, I'm telling you, you can recognize this within yourself when the foundation is stable and sound, and you are comfortable with it. But there are parts you don't understand, and parts that trouble you. But when you have a rejection, aversion, and refusal of the entire situation, the entire topic, the entire issue, then this is a type of intellectual deviation and misguidance. That's why, for example, when someone asks a question and I answer normally, and then they go and ask me another question, and a third and a fourth in the same vein, I know that the problem wasn't the question itself, but rather a symptom of her deeper malaise. The problem wasn't in the branches, but in the roots. So it needs a different approach. A 10th question, by the way, is related to the previous one. So, as an ordinary person, are there any Simple steps or guidelines I can consider to determine if this matter is indeed a suspicion or not, and thus be on the right track. That's a great approach. Look, sir, it's like the saying, don't give me a fish, but teach me how to fish. Okay, so how do you fish? The first step is to get rid of this psychological defeat. This first step is an internal matter, something no one else can do for you. Ibn al-Qayyim had a point about Ibn Taymiyyah for many years. In one of his books, he said, I didn't benefit from anything in the words of Shaykh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah like what he said. So, this is the thing Ibn al-Qayyim felt he benefited from the most. Who among Ibn Taymiyyah said, do not make your heart like a sponge absorbing doubts and suspicions, but rather make it like crystal, so that doubts pass through it and you see them without them entering you. What does this mean? For example, someone might tell me that Islam spread by the sword. There are two psychological approaches here. First is, yes, indeed, there were conquests and wars of apostasy and so on. It did spread by the sword, so what's the solution? Second approach is to say, it did indeed spread by the sword, or, for example, so what's the problem if it did spread by the sword? There's a psychological aspect to this. You've been presented with a doubt, absorbed it, and started looking for a solution. This is a psychological flaw, but if you sit and ponder, asking yourself, did it spread by the sword or not? Is this true? Even if it is true, is spreading by the sword a bad thing or a good thing? The correct psychological approach is to observe the doubt before you absorb it. So, for example, if I were to give this brother a remedy or give him steps to learn how to catch doubts, I would say that the moment a doubt arises, stop and observe it. Observe it from a distance. Don't let it affect you. Don't get involved. Remain like a doubt. When we come to examine it, and then we can judge and ask questions. We have 4 steps. I suggest 4 steps after you've stopped the doubt in front of you, preventing it from affecting you and shaking you. The first step is to consider how this issue is viewed in Islam. For example, Islam spread by the sword. I'm giving an example. We'll certainly come to this when we talk about the era of conquests. But the example of Islam spreading by the sword, what does Islam say? I mean the Quran and Sunnah. Even if this spread by the sword was true, was it an application of Islam or a mistake by Muslims? This is a crucial distinction. What does Islam itself, as the Quran and Sunnah, say about spreading the religion? Does it support spreading by the sword or not? This is a stage of examining the doubt in the foundations of Islam within Islam itself. A second stage is examining this idea in history in the application by Muslims. When Muslims spread Islam by the sword, did they truly spread it by the sword or not? Is the statement by the sword true or false? Okay, let's look at other nations. Did other nations expand and spread their ideas by the sword or by other means like olive branches and roses? For example, let's say I take the West as an example, considering it the superior civilization. The civilization that is always the source of doubt and suspicion is the spread of Western ideas by the sword present in their ideology, in their philosophy, among their philosophers and thinkers. What is their stance on it when they implemented it and spread themselves and their ideas? Did they spread it by the sword or by roses, olive branches and meteor? When I ask these questions, I'm telling them to consider 5 steps. The first step is to stop the doubt and not collapse psychologically in the face of it. A second step is what Islam says about this statement, the Quran and Sunnah, so I can know if this is from Islam and Muslims have deviated from it, or if this is from Islam and Muslims have implemented it, or if this is not from Islam and the Muslims deviated and did it, then I'll see how the Muslims implemented it. Did they implement it as Islam says, or did they deviate in its application from what Islam says? That's the third step. The fourth step, okay, we've changed religions, ideas, and methodologies. What is their stance on this, on spreading the idea by the sword? What is their intellectual stance on it? I mean, in their books, their holy books, the ideas of their philosophers, their theorists, and their experts. Then the issue of Islam by the sword. I'll apply these points to it. When Islam spread by the sword, is this found in the Quran and Sunnah? No, the Quran and Sunnah say no. There is no compulsion in religion, and Muslims throughout their history have never forced anyone to convert to Islam. I mean, historically, no one was ever put under the sword and told convert or you will be killed. There was always a third option, which is you want to remain as you are and pay the jizya, like a tax, in exchange for our protection. This existed in other nations as well. Didn't other nations have jizya? You enter our religion, yes, this jizya poll tax that was imposed in our Islamic history is considered a form of subjugation. This jizya is something that will be used now, for example. I mean, what I want to tell you is that a while ago, Germany was going to take over immigrants. Germany had a problem with a shortage of soldiers, so they would take over those who attained German citizenship and might use them to fight in Palestine. And whoever refused to fight in Palestine or in Iraq or anywhere Muslim would have their citizenship revoked. Don't these people wish that German law included the jizya, pay a tax and don't participate in a war you don't agree with? This jizya is a great thing, but the suspicion turned it into something reprehensible. Now, if a Muslim is in a country that will fight Muslims and I don't agree with this war, I wish I could pay the jizya and get out of this predicament. This is what the Muslims were doing. So, I'm telling you, this is the issue of Islam and the sword. Now, let's look at how other nations spread their influence and expanded their states. America, Europe, England, France, and these people, when they were global superpowers, they spread their influence. Westernization, the spread of permissiveness, the spread of moral decay. How did they spread their ideas? Even their ideas about democracy and human rights became their own rights. Were they sitting idly by, sending us preachers and human rights activists, or did they come with their warships and weapons, occupy our lands, establish states, open institutions and create media outlets after militarily controlling us and setting up military bases? We can only sell our oil in dollars, and we can only make agreements that align with American and European national security interests. How did countries that have expanded throughout history do so? Therefore, if a person were to overcome or rather rid themselves of the psychological defeatism evident in the first point, and observe these 4 steps for themselves, what does Islam say about this? Second, how did Muslims apply this principle? Did they apply it as Islam dictates, or did they deviate from it? How do other nations, ideologies, and religions view this principle? How did other nations and religions apply this principle? At that moment, you will be surprised to find that the doubt in this context reveals to you the greatness of Islam, its superiority, its elevation, and its transcendence over all these earthly, man-made systems. You know, Professor Muhammad, where the problem lies. The problem is that people, specifically on social media, because as you know, we have phones in our hands and our lives have become centered on our phones. We receive basic information from our phones and so on. As you know, when you see academic material, imagine not the material being discussed. Anyone enters the second, not the first, the second, the third, And the fourth, they see the first one writing that Islam spread by the sword or something, and that's it. A second one is actually reading mountains of material, but because they see this one writing it, they just repeat it, and so on, and it becomes an endless sequence. So, whoever enters after the 500th comment goes in and believes it. That's the story. So, don't let your heart be like a sponge. That's the problem. You have to have a degree of immunity, a degree of self-restraint. If you open your house to every passerby, will you still be able to if you have a house, and anyone can come and go as they please? Is it still a house or just a street? Yes, it's just a street, or maybe in a coffee shop. So, the first crisis is truly a psychological one. A psychologically resilient person, someone with immunity, is better able to cope with life. You know, even in their normal interactions, people say things like, "Take them down with your voice." We have a saying in Egypt, what's this? They say, he comes stop to someone who comes in with a loud voice and is clearly in a bad psychological state. There has to be a limit. And honestly, I wish all Islamic speakers, of course, it's a talent. Not all of them will be able to do this, but I want to mention one of the great examples of this, Sheikh Hazem Abu Ismail, may God release him. When a broadcaster would come and attack him, Sheikh Hazem would say, "He's trying to provoke me." Yes, and Sheikh Hazem would say, "No, who told you that?" I remember Ibrahim Isser once saying to him, "The origin of the consensus is not in my hands," as evidenced by what he said to him, "God willing. Professor Ibrahim, you've become the Sheikh of Al-Azhar, and the consensus is with you, and you've become the Sheikh of Al-Azhar," and so on. I mean, when they say to him, for example, "You're going to ban alcohol or you're going to ban tourism," the system takes them by the voice and says, "Yes, of course, because we are a Muslim country and we want God to bless us, and alcohol is forbidden, nudity is forbidden, so yes, of course, I'm going to ban it. I'm going to ban nude tourism, and I'm going to ban alcohol, but I won't do it all at once, because it's human nature. You can't be in darkness and then have a flashlight turned on in your eyes. There has to be a kind of gradual approach." Meanwhile, you find the psychologically defeated Islamist sitting like that in front of the broadcaster as if he were an accused in a courtroom cage. "You're going to ban tourism," he says. "No, it's not in our plan to cancel tourism, and tourism is an important source of national income." He's just adopted, meaning this defeated mentality. He's defeated, he won't be able to express Islam accurately. He tells you, you have the jizya poll tax and you'll make the Christians pay the jizya. He says, "No, we've become a nation of citizens, and I don't know what else, Sheikh. I'm telling you, the jizya is a very great thing. You imagine the jizya is something bad, the jizya is something great." And he explains. So this is the first and most important difference, this psychological impact. You have psychological immunity, psychological protection. The rest of the intellectual issue is easy. Well, may God reward you, Professor Muhammad. Of course, with the end of question 10, the first axis has ended, and this episode has ended. This is the third episode, and God willing, we will continue in the fourth episode of this blessed series, 100 Questions in History and Civilization. So, the next episode will be about Islamic civilization, and we will enter the next axis, God willing, about Islamic civilization, and we will have important and urgent questions, God willing, until we meet again to watch more programs about Islamic history and to learn about its events, victories, defeats, leaders and scholars, its events and secrets, governance and politics, for wars and battles. Simply follow